Adverse repercussions of the widespread teaching of English to the 1.5 billion English language learners around the world include the threat it poses to local languages and cultures, and the potential English has to become a private gain rather than a social good. However, English teaching does not have to be a threat to social justice, especially since English language classrooms are where students can interact with others from different social and linguistic groups, explore controversial social issues, and develop intercultural understanding and global competence. This presentation describes my journey over 3 decades, from teaching English during the 1992 LA Uprising, through 9/11, to the current Myanmar protests. Reading excerpts from my introduction in a book I'm currently editing, I will demonstrate the many ways that one can teach for peace as one teaches English. The book I'm reading for, Teaching for Peace and Social Justice in Myanmar, Agency, Identity, and Critical Pedagogy, focuses on the praxis of teaching for peace on the local level. It brings together 21 contributors, half of whom are from Myanmar, a country with the notorious distinction of having one of the longest civil wars in history, and which now is in the midst of a military coup. To contextualize and humanize the process of teaching for peace, the chapters in the book are launched with personal narratives of the authors, how they found their way into this field. In keeping with this practice, I start my introduction describing my journey to peace education, and more specifically to this book on peace building in Myanmar, which starts with what I call a rude awakening and then a late life crisis. About a decade later, it was déjà vu. There I was, this time with a freshly minted Ph.D. in international education from the University of Southern California. It was the first weeks of my full-time position at APU, and I was so confident in my abilities that I had agreed to allow a Chinese delegation of about a half dozen people sit in the back of my ESL writing class to observe me. Well, they ended up coming back to observe another day because all the planes were grounded. They could not return to China. The date was September 11, 2001. The visitors got to see firsthand how I would handle a class of students from all over the world, including the Middle East, respond to this event. Perhaps the guests emboldened me, but I told the students to return their textbooks to the bookstore, and I handed out a new syllabus. The focus of our writing class would be 9/11 and their analysis of the event and its aftermath. We established ground rules for the course and civil open discourse. They would work in small groups to find, read, discuss, summarize, synthesize related articles, and they would draft a paper that the students would be writing, editing, and sharing throughout the course. This time, we dealt with what was happening head on, and we came together to try to understand it through group reading and writing projects. So fast forward about 2 decades, and I'm still here at APU, now a professor and currently interim associate dean, who researches and writes about intercultural communication, religious identity, educational language policy in Myanmar, but also peace building. It may seem odd for a language teacher educator to focus on peace building. Perhaps it is kind of a late life crisis, but the more I engage in research, the question of why we teach languages looms larger than how it's done. There is a convenient overlap of social justice and peace in the fields of language and cultural learning. Learning about and respecting the other is key to intercultural communication. English, on the other hand, seems to have a more sinister history, as English has played no small part in the colonization of oppressed people in many parts of the world, sometimes leading to the death of languages and cultures when English replaces non-dominant language as the early primary levels of education. As one ages, one tends to think about legacy and what one has done to make the world a better place. Producing better English speakers is not a compelling reason compared to advancing social justice and world peace. Thus, peace building is now the focus of my scholarship and research, and when it is appropriate, my teaching. After this chapter draft was completed, COVID broke out. And soon after that, the George Floyd arrest recording was made public, showing a police officer holding Mr. Floyd down in a chokehold that resulted in his death in spite of his continued cries, "I can't breathe." This enraged not only people of color, but all people of conscience. This was the largest protest we'd witnessed in decades in the US. It reminded me of the LA Uprising of 1992, but this one was different. It felt like it was everywhere and impacted everyone. Systemic racism and white supremacy were not topics limited to my classes anymore. The nation was being schooled, and these topics were being discussed while we sheltered at home, watching protests on our screens and on the streets, or joining protests with masks and social distancing. If good came from this, it was that more of us were finally getting it. I wondered if previous students who had denied that systemic racism was a thing in former courses, I wondered what they were thinking now. The nation was having a crash course in injustice and our complicity in it. Another awakening was taking place, but not just for me, as this one was on a national scale. A spate of webinars took place to inform faculty how to change their curriculum and pedagogy to be more anti-racist. Academic organizations provided links to a host of anti-racist educational resources. In saying I am now concerned with more than just teaching how to teach English, I do not mean to convey that helping people learn to teach others how to speak languages is not important. It is. In fact, language classrooms can be a place where students interact with people they might never have met otherwise, and thus it has a great potential for learning with and from the other. The language classroom is also where students can acquire not only an additional language, but a new identity and an expanded worldview. Language students can hone their communication skills needed for peace building, such as deep listening, speaking with respect, showing concern, and inviting others to talk when they practice these skills while engaging in small group work and task-based learning. These are often used in language classrooms. Students can learn to apply a critical lens to critique oppressive systems through topics that focus on current events and issues of social justice, sometimes found in English language and I assume other language textbooks. I've invested 40 years in the field of language education, and I see great value in it. My point is that my focus in teacher education has shifted from merely teaching others to improve the English of their students to enlarging their understanding of the peace dividend that learning and valuing other languages, cultures, and peoples can have. It is exciting to see how new trends such as translanguaging are being explored to support this more inclusive, anti-hegemonic view of language learning and teaching. Education is both powerful and dangerous. As Paulo Freire has noted, education can either indoctrinate or liberate. It can be a tool for conformity, or it can lead to transformation. Metra reminds us that education can have other results by stagnating in the middle, avoiding either extreme, but resulting in mixed results, and the loss of full transformative potential that peace education can have. I contend that education is crucial to peace building, but it needs to be a critical education which interrogates inequalities, examines power structures, and acknowledges and unleashes agency to teachers and students. Since international education was my training in Southeast Asia, where I often worked and researched, I made Myanmar, the country where my husband was born, my focus. Myanmar is on the cusp of change after decades of civil war, international isolation, and neglect of the education sector. Myanmar is a rich context to learn of the possibilities of teaching for peace. Through leading 3 study abroad trips on the Thai-Burma border and engaging in a Fulbright at Yangon University in 2016, and by speaking at several conferences in Myanmar spanning over a decade, I've had the opportunity to hear dozens of stories in the struggle for peace. And I want those stories to be shared. And that is how this book came about. This is my 4th edited volume, and as the editor, I see my role as creating a space where something creative and transformative can take place by bringing together people who have a common passion, It's a space where we share our stories, learn from each other, and encourage and inspire all those who join. We speak of circles, of communities of practice, but we should consider our scholarly circles to be more like horseshoes, creating a space for others to join. For those of us in power who have access to publishing and anti-racist practices, we need to welcome and support Indigenous voices that have not been heard. So this book, with almost half of the authors from Myanmar, is an attempt to do that. So welcome to our open community. We don't have all the answers or agree on all the ones we do have, but we are open to being informed and influenced by one another. I woke up in Mandalay in 2018, the morning I was to deliver a lecture there, with 5 words in my head that encapsulated what I was trying to convey on the topic pedagogies of peace. The 5 words form 3 questions. Who's missing? Why? What next? This seems to be the core of what educators who are concerned about social justice and peace building are asking. Who is missing in our classrooms, our textbooks, our graduation ceremonies, school administration, media, movies, soap operas, businesses, leadership positions, or government representatives? And as a consequence of their absence, what languages and cultures are being ignored or excluded? The subtitle of this volume is Agency, Identity, and Critical Pedagogy. This first question of who is missing addresses identity, while the next question, why are they missing, addresses the critical aspect of this book. Why do some groups not have the same access to quality education and do not enjoy the same graduation rates and outcomes that the dominant group has? The critical view taken in the book interrogates the power structures in place that prevent some groups from achieving as much as others. A critical peace education lens examines identity-based violence and entrenched structural and cultural violence as causes of their invisibility and the obstacles that certain groups may encounter more than others. So the final question, what next, addresses agency and pedagogy. What can we do about this? And more specifically, what can teachers do? Teachers are everywhere, in every province, city, town, village, and they have abundant access to the country's most valuable resource. It's young people. Teachers can and are changing the world, although they might not all be totally aware of their agency to do so. These stories will hopefully encourage them, awaken them, and embolden them in their work. To situate the connections of TESOL and peace building, let me start with a few key definitions. Firma states that peace is undefined, but notes this ambiguity is a double-edged sword, as it empowers students to continually define and redefine peace in meaningful and engaged dialogue, and hence creates radical openings, unquote. This is akin to Freire's thoughts on critical pedagogy, which he said must be constantly made and remade. It also resonates with Baha and Hatzopoulos' claim that diversity of local meaning of peace is a strength. Peace is often defined not by the absence of violence, negative peace, but by the presence of just and equitable nonviolent means to address conflict and injustices, positive peace. Moreover, comprehensive peace addresses structural and indirect violence, such as racism and sexism, when access to resources such as food, health, employment, or educational opportunities is diverted to the wealthy or privileged groups, such as the military in some contexts. Comprehensive peace also addresses cultural violence, which are aspects of culture, including language, ideology, religion, and science, used to justify structural violence, making it seem natural or normal. My understanding of peace requires ongoing work in 3 different dimensions. The protection of human rights, which would be legal, political dimensions, the understanding of the causes of conflict, and the importance of diversity, which is more the intellectual or educational dimensions, and the development of human compassion, the important spiritual, religious, and social dimensions. Comprehensive peace education helps people acquire and apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills needed for peace building in order to transform the world to be more just, understanding, and compassionate in every discipline. Although education is often a place of indoctrination rather than transformation, educators can play a key role in peace building with an education for peace approach to their pedagogy and scholarship. Reardon defines peace education as, quote, educational policy, planning, pedagogy, and practice that can provide learners in any setting with the skills and values to work towards comprehensive peace. Well, just as wars begin with thoughts that take root in our minds and hearts, so too does peace begin in our imagination. Thus, peace can be fostered and taught. Education for peace is no easy task, since learners come with memories of injustices that need to be voiced, misinformation that needs to be unlearned, and hurtful ways of interacting that needs to be challenged and changed. For transformation to take place, educators from pre-kindergarten classrooms to postdoctorate research teams need to be aware of what is at stake if we neglect to foster human compassion in students and fail to prioritize the teaching and research of issues that impede human flourishing. What is at stake if education for peace is neglected is not only the quality of life, but the ability for some to live their lives at all. Pope Paul VI stated, "If you want peace, work for justice." This speaks to the connection between peace and justice, and more specifically to social justice, which is concerned with providing all people access to resources like food, health, transportation, education, and meaningful work that allows them to thrive regardless of the social class, cultural background, religious beliefs, or other ascribed or vowed identities. When educators seek to apply a social justice approach to their teaching and to teacher education, this, according to Zeichner, goes beyond a celebration of diversity to attempt to prepare teachers who are willing and able to work within and outside their classrooms to change the inequalities and inequities that exist in both schooling and in the wider society, unquote. A social justice-oriented teaching framework is not just teaching about social justice. It is using a social justice lens to guide the curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment tools, and applying and engaging in social justice not just in the classroom, but in society and the world. Convoys of military trucks filled with armed soldiers line the streets of the major cities in Myanmar. Protesters are being shot dead and others wounded. Some 23,000 prisoners were released. Some say injected with drugs with orders to cause mayhem. And they have done this before, emptying the prisons to make room for dissenters, which in this case number in the thousands. They fill me with hope, these protesters, who so bravely stand up to injustice. So how do we respond? My work of late has focused on supporting peace building in Myanmar, but now my panels are being canceled with speakers in Myanmar fearing reprisals, and publications are being put on hold, rethinking who may be put at risk, and grants and sabbatical plans are being rewritten now that Myanmar is no longer a possible host. I wake up at night with visions and dreams as my mind tries to make sense of all the images seen on Facebook and the news. Was our peace-building work there from 2015 to 2020 in vain, or has it helped? What is next for Myanmar? You know, vision, and more specifically envisioning peace, can help communities in conflict find common ground. However, sustainable peace cannot be realized at just the local level. Larger, systemic issues need to be addressed. A sustainable peace cannot be achieved in the midst of social injustice, economic inequality, and political instability. Vision, or mental imagery, can be used to help us see and address these larger issues that may impede peace. Last January, about this time, I was in Mandalay University offering a 4-day seminar on peace building across the curriculum to 40 faculty members and graduate TESOL students. We asked them to work in small groups envisioning peace while they drew on posters that were displayed and discussed in gallery walks. Many of those teachers are now on strike, taking part in a massive civil disobedience movement. I wonder now, a year later, how their vision of peace building has changed. We are providing tools to examine and revise their curriculum to support social justice and peace building, and now they are in the midst of protests and a full-on movement. If all goes as planned, the book will get published this year, and the 21 authors who have shared their stories of how they have been teaching for peace in Myanmar will be voiced. I hope readers will be inspired by these brave teachers who for now are not teaching at all, at least not in their classrooms, although their actions in the CDM speak and teach volumes. Thank you for listening and for the opportunity to share the interesting intersections of TESOL and peace building and the impact this can have in places like Myanmar.